Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the show. Obviously, the federal election was on Monday. The results were somewhat surprising to some people, and so joining me now to discuss the final results of the election is Jeff Watson. He's a former Conservative member of Parliament. Kate Graham is a former leadership candidate for the leadership of the Ontario Liberal Party, the co-chair of the Ontario Liberals' 2022 platform, and their candidate in London North Centre next year. Kirsty Kirkup is a national reporter for the Globe and Mail, and Chris Hall is the host of CBC's The House Radio. I'll start now with you, Kate. Many people are saying that the Prime Minister called the election, obviously in August, but the results of the election, according to some people, haven't changed all that much. Obviously, there are some individual ridings that flipped, but what would you say to a voter who is, a little bit angry that we had to spend all of this money and then now we're just heading back to basically the same parliament?
Sure. Well, first off, thanks for having me on again, Wyatt. And it's a treat to get to have this chat with all of you. There's certainly a lot to unpack from this week. To your question, I'll start by kind of picking a little bit, if you don't mind, at the underlying assumption. And this was a big part of the campaign narrative was, why are we having this election and so on? And, there's always good discussion to be had, but I think we need to be really careful about a message that we should be trying to avoid elections. Like there's something that should be put off, just let people govern forever unchecked. I teach political science at Western and Huron, and I had lots of students for whom this was their very first campaign. August is normally a really kind of sleepy time, and instead there were hundreds of thousands of people all across the country talking about the direction we want to go, talking about big policy ideas. So for me, the value of a campaign, it's not just the outcome at the end. And I actually do think there were some important changes that happened on Monday that we may be, I'm sure we'll get into this, but we may be minimizing a bit. I think the real value of a campaign is the opportunity for us as Canadians to intentionally and deliberately talk about the direction that we're going. And this campaign, like everyone, delivered that. And I want to see a lot more of that. People on doorsteps, text messaging, Zoom calls, whatever, talking to each other. It's not something for me that we should be trying to avoid as a country. If anything, it's something we should value more and take advantage of the opportunities when they come up to talk to one another about the kind of country we want to be in, the direction we want to go in.
Kirsty, I'll ask you about sort of some specific races. Were there any specific races at the local level, like in individual ridings, that sort of surprised you, or that people weren't necessarily expecting to flip or to go one way that did?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a great question, Wyatt. I don't know if perhaps there's other people who want to weigh in on the kind of drill down at the local level and some of the ridings that flipped. I think that maybe perhaps one thing that jumps out at me is some of the races that involve cabinet ministers. So we know that Miriam Monsef, who of course was running again in the riding of Peterborough, Kawartha, she lost her seat. And actually the Prime Minister went to her riding in the final days of the campaign. There was a rally held there. I was on the road with him the last week of the campaign, and Miriam Monsef openly talked about the fact that, this is always a close race. And in this case, she was defeated. And of course, we did see as well Deb Schulte, who also the former seniors minister, who lost her seat as well. The Prime Minister also going to her riding in the final days of the campaign. And ultimately, there are 4 female cabinet ministers, 3 that were defeated, and 1, of course, Catherine McKenna, who did not run again. So I think that's going to be an important kind of discussion going forward. What does Trudeau's cabinet look like in this parliament? But again, some of the riding races that I was interested in included those cabinet ministers who ultimately ended up losing the race.
It's interesting, Peter. You mentioned Peterborough, which broke its bellwether status, which was interesting, and then you also mentioned cabinet, which is going to be interesting, obviously, because he's going to obviously have to try and have representation from every part of the province. So on that topic, the Liberals elected 2 MPs in Alberta. in Calgary Skyview and Edmonton Center, Randy Bosenalt and Georgian Hall. So, Jeff, I'll go to you next. What do you think went wrong for the Conservatives, and why do you think James and Jag Sahota lost their seats on Monday?
Well, I think some of it is local race, if you want to really kind of bore down into it. In the case of Calgary Skyview, you run a popular city councillor against the incumbent there, who hasn't been an incumbent for very long, and in a pandemic parliament that was largely virtual. That's a real challenge in terms of that race. And again, in Edmonton Centre, Randy Boisseneau, almost like an incumbent, he was there before, running against James Cumming. I had a concern all along, generally speaking, with a lot of the rookie MPs who probably only had about 5 months on the ground face-to-face in their communities before we went into a virtual parliament. How would they fare? Would they be able to connect with voters? That's not to say there aren't some challenges ahead for the Conservatives on the prairies, generally speaking. We can talk about where, maybe later on, about where the party may be rebranding itself or remaking its coalition, if you will, versus where they're at with the historic coalition. But voter turnout wasn't just down, it's that voters didn't come to support the parties they did before. That was a problem for Justin Trudeau. It was also a problem for Aaron O'Toole.
Chris, I'm going to ask you about party leadership. Yesterday, I believe it was, there was a member of the National Council on the Conservative Party, and perhaps I'll ask some others about this as well, but there was a member of the Conservative Party National Council who started a petition to remove him. Now there's kind of disagreements going back and forth on National Council of the Conservative Party between the National Council and the president of the party, Rob Batherson, and then there's also the Green Party, in which many people suspect that turmoil will arise in that party again. So speak maybe a little bit about party leadership and about which leaders you suspect we could see resignations from in the coming weeks.
I don't know how many resignations we're going to see, but you're absolutely right, Wyatt. The Conservatives will be having, I think, a deep discussion about a couple of things. The first is that Aaron O'Toole took the party in a different direction. He moved it more to the political center. He talked about spending, for example, $60 billion over 10 years on healthcare. So he wasn't as fiscally conservative, perhaps, as many would like. And he also, I think many people, if you look back at the campaign, will feel that a turning point was the way he managed the issues around gun control and the promise to look into the repealing the ban on the 1,500 assault-style firearms that the Liberals had put in place through a cabinet order back in May of 2020. So I think people felt a little confused about what he was actually saying when he came out in the middle of the campaign and had to amend and add a footnote to the platform to say all those firearms that are banned now would remain until this review was finished. So I think he will be one that will have at least some questions raised about the direction in which he took the party and that specific issue. Annamie Paul, I think, as you said, has had a lot of trouble with her internal dissension over her leadership. If anyone is to resign, I suspect it might be her. She certainly hinted at that during an interview during the campaign. And Jagmeet Singh, look, I mean, I think he has some questions coming his way as well. The party did not really increase seat total. I think they just got one extra seat. They went from 44, in 2015 down to 2011. I'm sorry, down to 24, and then now 25. And it's a little hard to see where the growth is coming from. They were shut out Toronto, which was, I think, a disappointment. Davenport was one riding they expected to win. They didn't pick up some seats where they thought they might in the Lower Mainland. So all of them will face some questions, and we'll maybe see if their futures might be decided before the next formal leadership review in the case of the Conservatives anyway.
Kate, on the same topic of party leadership, many people, and there were many political pundits who were saying that Justin Trudeau called the election if he didn't get a majority government. Many people suspecting that he would face calls within his own party to resign. So do you see Justin Trudeau staying on as leader of the Liberal Party?
Yeah, this has been sort of the obsession, I think, of the discussion in the last few days is, how many of these leaders will be on the next stage and so on. And, this might sound a little Pollyanna of me, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think for all of the parties, elections can and should be moments where they reevaluate, what was their pitch to voters, what resonated, what didn't. We tend to lay so much of the success and blame at the feet of the leader as if they, as individuals are responsible for the victories and the losses. And I mean, of course, to an extent that is true, but at the end of the day, a party is a collection of people who come together because they want to accomplish specific things. And so I hope that for every party, I hope it's a lot more than just how did the leader do and, how do the numbers stack up? It should be a much more introspective look at, what are the ideas that we put forward that caught on? We're in a minority setting right now. We actually are going to some leadership across all of the parties, including being able to work together on things that Canadians expressed quite clearly matter to us right now: climate change, housing, childcare, and so on. And so just maybe it's the political scientist to me, but I'm kind of craving a deeper discussion inside and outside of parties right now, where it's not just about should the leader stay or go, but instead, who are we as a party? What is the message that we have for kids? And what's opportunity in this new environment to come together, I hope, and be able to deliver on things that we know people care about.
I'm just gonna give you a quick follow-up question, Kate, because I seen you on a panel on with Steve Paikin, and I seen on your Twitter as well that you were at the Justin Trudeau event in London where the Prime Minister had rocks thrown at him. So I'm just gonna ask you, that was obviously seen as a very divisive moment and an unfortunate moment for Canada. So I'm just gonna basically say, in your view, your political science view, and just in your view as a upcoming politician after next year, how can we stop the divisiveness around politicians to this extent, and how can we make it back to where it used to be, where it was kind of, if you disagreed with someone, you showed it at the ballot box?
Mm-hmm. I think it's such an important question. So I was at that Justin Trudeau event, and I had my 1-year-old baby in my arms. There were lots of kids there, lots of seniors there. And there was actually a chain link fence between the space. It was a patio that the event was happening. And then there was, I can only describe it as a huge mob of people screaming, yelling, signs, quite violent. I'll be honest, with a baby in my arms, I was a little afraid about the tone. And then when things started to get thrown, it escalated to a whole other level. I caught eyes at one point with someone who was on the other side of the chain link fence, and they were yelling and screaming and so on. And I can remember kind of thinking in that moment, like, it looks like a cry for help. Like, I can't imagine a scenario where you feel so angry and so powerless that, being at an event screaming at a political leader and throwing things at them feels like a reasonable form of expression. You got to be in a place for that to seem okay. And so, rather than just saying like, that's not okay and we should, get rid of that from politics, I actually think we need to be paying attention to the people who right now are feeling so threatened and so alone and so powerless that they're resorting to these things that otherwise seem bananas. We need to be understanding what it is that, that we can do to hopefully come together. I like to think that's what happens after elections. Campaigning and governing are not the same. And I hope that it's not just a deepening of that divide, but instead we have an opportunity to say, okay, there's clearly a lot of Canadians who are not happy with how things are going right now. They're angry, they're upset, and we need to hear from them as well, because they have a right to be heard, and it can't be throwing rocks at someone. It's got to be something else.
See, I'll go to you because you were obviously on the campaign trail. I was at 2 of Justin Trudeau's press conferences, and at both of them, there were obviously lots of protesters there. I was at the one in Cambridge, which was probably one of the most, I guess you could say, kind of heated ones with a lot of protesters. So just how big of an issue do you see division in an election? Obviously, it's an election and there's different points of view, and so there is going to be division. But how big of an issue just do you see kind of this ultimate division in the political sphere?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting discussions that's unfolded as we've watched these protests play out in the context of the election campaign is some people saying, well, political leaders, in years past or, in previous decades have always faced threats. And I think that is, of course, fundamentally true. If you are a politician putting yourself out there, there's always going to be a degree of threat. That being said, though, I do think that experts have pointed to the changing nature of the situation that is unfolding. And there were a few things that made these protests unique. Number one, social media, of course, and experts have described, of course, the movement of particularly the far right on social media and how how social media was used as a tool to obviously quickly share the address of locations and get people to converge on a particular site in short order. And then also there was the element of the fact that this election was playing out during the context of COVID-19. So I'll take you to when I was in Bolton, where there was a big protest that ultimately the event was canceled because of the security threat. And it was a very surreal event because essentially we were outdoors in a parking lot of a Hilton hotel, kind of backed into a corner. Our media bus was parked behind a stage, if you will, as the placard for the Liberals. It said Trudeau won it because the party, by the way, decides to wrap the bus, not the journalists who are on it. And we were waiting to find out if the leader, Justin Trudeau, was going to come out, and security was obviously in the process of assessing this event. But why were we standing in a parking lot for this event? Well, they wanted to have a rally. They didn't want to have a bunch of people because again, the risk of COVID is reduced when you are outdoors. And so there were unique aspects of the security threat because of this very reason. It's easier to secure a site if you have a leader, for example, going into a hotel and security at each door, for example, to screen those who are able to get close to the leader. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I think there's a bit of nuance that people maybe are missing, talking about some of the historical threats, of course, that existed for leaders, but there were a few different dimensions to what we saw in this campaign with, again, the element of social media and also, the kind of nature of the events that were being held. There was an event later on in the campaign that was held in Brampton, Ontario, 400 people packed into a room. Of course, that led to questions of why are you doing this during COVID? And I think, frankly, the answer was that because of security threats, they couldn't hold that type of event outside. So they needed to have it in an event in an indoor space.
Okay, Jeff, I'm going to go back to party leadership and just a question around the Conservative Party, and perhaps you can give some more insight on just the idea of Aaron O'Toole staying on as leader, but then also just who do you think is, because obviously Aaron O'Toole wasn't the right person that Canadians seed as leader of the Conservative Party to be the Prime Minister. So is there anybody in particular that you're like, yeah, if that person became leader of the Conservative Party, then I do really think that they would be able to appeal to Canadians?
I think that would be putting the cart before the horse. First of all, the pro forma question that usually follows elections at the first annual general meeting for all political leaders is the question of whether there should be a leadership review or not, unless, of course, you're Maxime Bernier. There is no mechanism for removing the leader, so it's his party in perpetuity. But so members are going to be thinking about what the election results mean to them. You've obviously heard the leader out making the case for why he thinks he needs a bit more time. I think central to the question by the time we get to an annual general meeting will probably be the question of what this election, what direction Aaron O'Toole is looking to go. I think if you're talking to insiders, there's some quiet talk, maybe not so quiet talk, about remaking what the Conservative coalition is. You heard the comment during the campaign. Aaron O'Toole said, "This is not the party of your father or your grandfather." Now, curiously, he campaigned with Brian Mulroney, but not Stephen Harper. And there may be some messages in that. I don't know that Aaron O'Toole is sort of pivoting ideologically or sort of, looking at a set of issues, just come to the center a little bit. I think he aims to remake the coalition. Maybe it's less about rural Canada and more about the big cities, if you will. That may mean a different set of demographics, a different set of issues, if you will. So he's looking, I think, to play on different terrain. Every Conservative party that's governed has a coalition that they have to manage. So I think if there's a leadership question or there's questions around the leader, do we manage the existing coalition better? You may see people emerge like Pierre Poilievre or others who may quietly or maybe not so quietly talk about that. Maybe it's through proxies. Or do we remake that coalition and do something boldly different? Regardless of whether we have the review or not, I think the question about direction will be a significant one. If we're remaking the coalition, that may mean people like the PPC will be around as a fact, with or without Justin Trudeau as the Liberal leader.
All right, Chris, I'll ask you one last question regarding Jeff just mentioned the People's Party. And it's interesting because as much as they didn't win a seat in this election, they still took some seats away from the Conservatives. Obviously, the majority of people think that, PPC supporters are former Conservatives, which I think a certain part of that is true. Although there were some pundits that were saying some of them were former Green supporters who didn't believe in vaccinations. There's lots of different feelings around that. But how big of an impact overall do you think the People's Party had, and do you actually think that they were the party that took seats away from the Conservatives?
Oh, that's a big question. Let me start with the People's Party and what it stands for. It says it's a party of freedom, but it coalesced around this question of whether mandatory vaccines should be in place and whether people should have to prove that they've been vaccinated to go about parts of their daily lives, going to a theater or going to a restaurant, that sort of thing. That's what I think fueled the growth of the People's Party, as opposed to other aspects of their platform. They are not obviously strong on immigration. They are fiscally conservative, more libertarian in the way they believe that people should have a minimal amount of government interference in their life. I'll be watching to see, Wyatt, if the party continues to have support and continues to be a political movement, if COVID recedes into the background and the vaccines become less and less of an issue. Do I think they took seats away from the Conservatives? I mean, the Conservatives, there was a 5% vote across the country. They were stronger in some areas, including in Jeff's part of the world in southwestern Ontario. I don't know if they cost them directly seats. It didn't help. But as you pointed out, a lot of pollsters in particular felt that the collapse of the Green Party, or in ridings where the Green Party wasn't present this time, that some of those people who had voted Green in the past might have voted for PPC as well. So to answer your question, I think they weren't helpful to the Conservative cause. I can't at this point to specific ridings they lost because of the PPC vote, but it certainly didn't help. The big question, I think, is more about where does the People's Party find itself as we look ahead to a next election or the next 4 years? Is it possible for them to carve out a niche of people who are disillusioned with all the political parties, and perhaps in particular with the Conservative Party, given Bernie's own past association with them?
Alrighty, well, go ahead,
Can
Jeff.
I jump in on that question?
Yes,
actually, I think on the question of costing the Conservative Party of Canada seats, I think actually the more interesting split was the progressive split. There were a number of places where the progressive split allowed Conservative candidates to win. And I think that number is actually more than the PPC would have cost the Conservatives. I think for those who've done a deep dive on the switcher question for PPC and CPC, maybe about 30 to 40% of them, 40 at the top end, were switchers from the CPC. So I wouldn't suggest that that was a huge factor in a lot of seats. But that progressive split, remember, in Justin Trudeau's great strength in terms of a majority government, it was unifying the progressive coalition behind him. And so some of that's fragmenting a little bit. If you get below the top line numbers, there are a lot of interesting sort of regional things. And when you dive down into the numbers, the only thing I will say, regardless of who the PPC are, they're the only party that was actually up in every region of the country in terms of their vote. Now they're starting from a small base, mind you, but the referendum being on the question of vaccines today. But again, that question, if there's going to be a remaking of the Conservative coalition, it may be that we create other issues where the traditional coalition might find itself seeping over either to the PPC, or we'll see what happens with Derek Sloan if he gets this True North party off the ground officially, or whether that was a press release. There could be some options for more fragmentation in the traditional Conservative coalition.
Alrighty, well, Jeff, Chris, Kirsty, and Kate, thank you all so much for joining me, and it was great chatting with you all, and look forward to getting into the next Parliament.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having us on.
Thank you.